Welcome to SNC's Power Up webinar on commercial and industrial customer perceptions of power reliability. My name is Spencer Zirkelbach. I will be your host for today's webinar and want to start off by saying thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We have a wide range of attendees from both private and public utilities, manufacturers, commercial customers, regulators, and consultancies from around the globe. Before we begin, I have a few administrative topics to cover. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be shared after the event along with the new 2021 C&I Reliability Report. Attendee microphones are muted, and we have turned off the chat feature. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions you have throughout this webinar. We will address all these questions at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, you can also use the Q&A function and a member of the SNC team will help. Finally, after you leave the webinar, you will be prompted with a one-question survey. We would greatly appreciate a few seconds of your time to provide feedback on today's content. Now that we have those out of the way, let me introduce our panelists who will be sharing their expertise with us. Kyle Julian has focused the past 17 years of his career on serving the medium voltage needs of C&I customers and is the mission critical application director at SNC. Brian Levitt is the author of the book Energy Resilient Buildings and Communities, A Practical Guide, and is a regulatory affairs director at SNC. Finally, we are extremely pleased to be joined by Dr. Chad Moutray, who is the chief economist at the National Association of Manufacturers. Dr. Moutray serves as NAM's economic forecaster and is the director of the Center of Manufacturing Research, where he leads efforts to produce thought leadership, data, and relevant insights to business leaders in the manufacturing sector. This webinar is focused on the perception of commercial industrial customers have on their power reliability. The industrial part of that audience consists heavily of manufacturers and are one of the largest energy consumers as well as sources of revenue for utilities. We wanted to bring in Chad's perspective, how these businesses have been doing, where he thinks they are going, and most importantly, what keeps them up at night. Chad is going to start us off with a poll to start this dialogue. Chad, take it away.
Thanks, Spencer, and thanks for everyone who's participating today. We're going to start off, as Spencer just noted, with the top challenges that you might be facing right now. You're going to see in a second, we did a survey with the National Association of Manufacturers where I'll show you our responses, but I'm interested to see where you are landing here as well. And as Spencer also noted, 30% of all of the energy consumed in the United States are really coming from the industrial sector. So this is why this is such an important topic for us in terms of understanding power reliability, costs, et cetera. Those are all things that really matter to the manufacturers. And so with that, I'm going to see what your responses are here. I think hopefully everyone is entering in their responses.
Yeah, we're still getting a couple trickle in here, so I'm just giving it a couple more seconds for people to respond to the poll. All right.
Okay, here we go. Let's see what you guys said. So the number one issue, supply chain interruptions. We continue to hear that in spades at the National Association of Manufacturers. A lot of companies are really struggling with that. And you can see also attracting a workforce. You'll see that is it's low everywhere I go. I hear that, as well as rising costs. And so all of those things are actually pretty consistent with what we're hearing nationally as well. So thanks for taking the time to do that. And we will now move on to my slides where I'll kind of discuss really what we're seeing in the manufacturing sector overall. The NAM Manufacturers Outlook Survey, as you can see here, we've been doing this survey really for 23 years, almost 24 years. This time last year, obviously COVID-19 hit and we saw a pretty tremendous decline in overall activity, the lowest since the Great Recession. But we bounced back really strongly, and I would actually argue that as we ended last year and began this year, manufacturing actually was a bright spot in the economy. And we really are back to where we were essentially two years ago in terms of overall optimism. The next slide will show that even more. And you can see that, as you looked at 2019, we really came off of the highs we were seeing in 2018. Actually, we had an all-time high in this measure in the summer of 2018. And last year, 2019 was really characterized by the trade war, slowing global growth. But we actually began 2020, people kind of forget this now, but we began 2020 with things somewhat stabilizing until the pandemic hit. And you see here that roughly 34% of our members were positive in their outlook in the second quarter of 2020. But that actually rose to roughly 88% in the most recent survey that came out in March. And so again, overall, we're seeing very strong growth kind of across the board in most of our sectors. When you look at the next slide, though, it will kind of show you that, I think one of the bigger questions that's out there is, what is the shape of the recovery, right? So we have the conversation about, is it a V-shaped or a check mark shaped or a K-shaped recovery? We can certainly talk about the K-shaped in the Q&A if you're interested in that. But you can see here that at the end of last year, roughly a third of our members said that they were already back at pre-pandemic levels of revenue. And if you kind of flash that forward to the end of this year, through the second half of 2021, that doubles to roughly 2/3 of our members say that they'll be back to pre-pandemic levels by the end of this year. That's pretty consistent with actually where I'm thinking we're going to be as well, that as we get to the second half of this year, you're going to see pre-pandemic levels of GDP, certainly of manufacturing production. And I think that's a nice encouraging sign that the sector is bouncing back pretty strongly. Yet you also can see here that we have a fair number, roughly 20% or more, that are seeing overall they won't get back until next year or sometime thereafter. So I think that's also notable to mention. The next chart will show you, it's a little bit of a repeat of what you just saw in terms of the poll that you just took. You can see the number one issue, at least in our survey, was rising raw material costs. We've seen this in a number of different indicators recently, including this morning. If you're following me on Twitter, you saw that I tweeted out about consumer prices. Consumer prices were the fastest monthly growth in 9 years. You're seeing producer price index figures, which are the most in more than a decade. And I think this really reflects those supply chain disruptions that you mentioned earlier in your responses, but it also, I think, just really shows just the strength right now that you're seeing in the sector, especially for steel, aluminum. A lot of commodity prices are really soaring right now. Logistics is also a big challenge, as well as you noted, attracting and retaining a quality workforce. Even though the labor market has changed so dramatically since this time last year, we continue to hear about how difficult it is for manufacturers to find talent. And so this is, again, what I call that the paradox, right? That even though we have more than 500,000 fewer workers today than we did this time last year, even though the unemployment rate is 6% versus 3.5%, which is what it was before the pandemic, you still are having trouble finding talent. And I think that speaks to just how changed the overall landscape is today. The next chart will show you manufacturing production. ISM. We'll do one more positive before we get to negative. So the ISM, Manufacturers Purchasing Managers Index, much like our survey, you can see, again, overall activity fell to the lowest level since the Great Recession in April of last year, but it's bounced back very strongly since then. And in fact, you've seen really since last summer, not just new orders and production that is expanding, which would be over 50, but you're also seeing numbers that are over 60 for much of that time, which would suggest really robust demand, really robust output. Employment lagged behind there for a while, but you can see that has also picked up pretty strongly more recently. And so overall, this again speaks to just how strong the manufacturing sector is. You've seen some weaknesses in some of these sentiment surveys on the service side, particularly as you had some additional restrictions in some locations. Moving globally, you see a lot of restrictions, especially in Europe and other places, Brazil, where they're still struggling with COVID-19. But manufacturing has somewhat been an outlier there, where we've pretty consistently seen some pretty strong numbers. So now I'll get to manufacturing production, which is the next slide. And we will be getting a new manufacturing production number in 2 days, right, on the 15th of April. This is showing you really what happened in February. Prior to February, we actually were seeing, again, a lot of really strong numbers are kind of across the board since last year, but certainly in the 4 months prior to that. The February numbers, more than anything, I think, speak to the weather disruptions that we were having in the sector, especially in Texas, where you actually had some power outages and a lot of bad weather really shut down chemical production, petroleum production, and a lot of other things that were in Texas. And it also speaks to the supply chain disruptions in general, right? The chip shortage that you continue to hear about in the motor vehicle sector, et cetera. As you move forward a couple of days, when we're going to be getting the March data, I would expect a nice rebound in March. And so that hopefully, I think we shouldn't make too much of the February number, although it is certainly notable that it was such a large decline. Next slide. It was the largest decline really we had seen since last April. Prior to the February numbers, we were just around 1% below pre-pandemic levels of manufacturing production. That fell to roughly 4% below. But as I just noted a second ago, I do expect a rebound in this figure in March. And I actually expect that by the time we get to the summer, we will be back at pre-pandemic levels of manufacturing production, which is a nice encouraging sign. We won't get back to where we peaked out. We actually peaked at manufacturing production activity in December of 2018. But certainly we're making some nice progress in that direction, which I think is an encouraging sign. Next chart. So I mentioned earlier the overall global environment, and we also on the 15th, coincidentally, are releasing our global manufacturing economic update, again, which you can find either on LinkedIn or Twitter from me. And you can see here the overall trend line of the top 9 markets that we sell into as manufacturers. 8 of them were expanding in the month of March. Some of these numbers actually hit all-time highs. So the German number, the Netherlands number, and Canada were the all-time highs in the series for those particular countries. Mexico continues to lag behind. And China actually has slowed in the last couple markets, although I don't make too much of that. They still, I think, are doing quite well, certainly relative to where they were pre-pandemic. The overall trend here is one of a pretty positive storyline here. Much more blue on this chart than you would have seen 6 months ago, as these countries are starting to emerge from the pandemic. You see that the IMF has predicted 6% growth this year in terms of global GDP. These are all really strong numbers, and you can see some records there in terms of even not only the European PMI number, but also the US is not far from its record pace. A couple, I guess the red flag here, the Brazilian number is positive in this case, but you're seeing some pretty significant restrictions here because of COVID-19, and I wouldn't be shocked if Brazil slips into contraction in April, given some of the weaknesses that we're seeing there. But anyway, nonetheless, otherwise, a very positive storyline. Next chart. So when you're looking at manufacturing employment, you saw we had a very strong number in March. We've had really strong growth in manufacturing employment really since last April, right? So you see here, 8 of the 9 last months, we've had positive growth in terms of manufacturing employment. January really was the only outlier there. But even with that, we still haven't made up for that 1.3 million employee loss that we had last April. And so as a result, the next chart will show you that we actually are down, 515,000 workers relative to where we were in February of last year. So we've lost about 500,000 workers. We're going to continue to make some progress in terms of closing that gap. I would expect we're going to increase at least 200,000 or more this year, but it's still that there is that gap there. And that again speaks to the paradox that I mentioned earlier, that we're still having so many members struggling with finding talent, and yet obviously on the employment side, there's still a pretty significant gap there. Now, the next chart will show you a little bit more detail in terms of that overall figure. We actually had 538,000 manufacturing job openings in February. That is just shy of the all-time high that we hit last October, which was 545,000 job openings in the sector. And to me, what this particular figure shows is that manufacturers are so upbeat in their overall outlook for the rest of this year that they're feeling confident in terms of being more willing to put postings out there to go out and kind of ramp up for what they expect to see later this year. So these job opening numbers are, to me, a nice encouraging sign that the sector is getting healthier. We've actually seen quits pick up, which suggests to me that you're starting to see some churn in the labor market again. And overall, these numbers are a nice positive sign. You're seeing similar figures for capital spending in the US. And again, I think that all just speaks to the stronger outlook in the sector. The next chart will show you, there it is, my outlook. So I expect us to grow, just shy of 7% this year. I have a 7 handle for the first quarter, the quarter that we just ended. And I have 8.5% for the second quarter. I wouldn't be shocked if that hits double digits, given the stimulus bills that are moving their way through Congress, not just the $1.9 trillion that was passed at the end of January, but also continued conversations about infrastructure and other spending that might be taking place. And so really robust numbers in terms of overall activity this year. Then you add to that, obviously, the fact that there's a lot of pent-up demand, right? And so some of the sectors that were the hardest hit, those stay-at-home areas, particularly on the service side, as people start getting vaccinated and start coming back out and spending money and going out and going to restaurants and bars and theaters and amusement parks and hotels, that obviously will provide a nice boost to overall activity. So there's a lot of upward potential here to these figures. Obviously, 6.8 is a nice rebound from last year's decline of 3.5%, which was the largest decline since 1946. In terms of manufacturing production, the next chart will show you that I'm expecting just shy of 8% growth in terms of manufacturing production this year. As I noted, I think in the next couple of months, we're going to hit pre-pandemic levels of manufacturing production. So again, those are all very nice, robust figures that hopefully will provide lots of time for utilities to provide lots of energy, right? So obviously a rebound in the manufacturing side will have some nice positive effects for energy consumption, and that makes power reliability that much more important. And so with that, I believe that is my last slide, and I'll turn it over to S&C.
Thanks so much, Chad. We're actually going to have another question now, which is, in your opinion, what is the biggest impact of energy outages on C&I companies? Chad just took us through a fantastic forecast of kind of how manufacturing companies, which represent a big chunk of the people we looked at. I'm going to get into the study in a little bit. Manufacturing companies are a big and important part of that. As we look at all this opportunity for these manufacturing companies to come back and come back strong, and hopefully they come back exactly as strong as Chad thinks that they will, there are some potential things that can hold them back. One of the things we looked at was supply chain interruptions, and that was identified as a big potential stumbling block. Well, part of that supply chain is energy. Energy is a resource, a core supply. So what do we think? How do we think that an interruption of that supply chain is going to impact? Our polls say cost of interruptions, particularly frequent interruptions. So this is going to, and of course, number 2 is, cost of downtime from longer interruptions. That's going to be very well in line with what we're about to talk about, because these costs of interruptions, whether they be long or short, really are a potential hindrance, according to the people we surveyed. So let's talk about the survey. I'm going to be sharing results today of an energy reliability survey that S&C conducted on commercial and industrial energy users. This is the 4th year that we've undertaken this survey. We do this so we can better understand the real-world experiences of C&I customers and how reliability impacts their day-to-day operations. For this report, S&C contracted the highly respected Frost & Sullivan to reach out to high-level managers responsible for power-related decisions at over 250 commercial and industrial companies in the U.S. The average annual revenue of the responding companies was $75 million, and they were pretty evenly distributed across the country. As you can see, we reached out to a healthy representation of manufacturing firms, as well as healthcare, education, retail, and small franchisees. We wanted to understand how energy outage impacts and opinions changed across these categories and across geographies, if at all. 2 of our primary takeaways were around changes in reliability trends and the economic impacts of outages. I'm going to briefly speak about those, and then my colleague Kyle Julian is going to talk about ways utilities are working with their C&I customers to improve this situation. So let's start with the discussion of some reliability trends that we found in the survey results. Probably the most important finding of this piece is that after 3 years of relative stability, we saw a major uptick in the frequency of outages for respondents. 44% of respondents said they lost power at least monthly. While I doubt that nationwide safety numbers are going to have doubled for 2020, it's important to remember a couple things. First, utility metrics like system average frequency, average interruption frequency interval, they always exclude momentary outages under 5 minutes, and they often exclude major event days where the power is out for long durations. Second, remember that these utility outage frequency numbers are systems averages. So if it's cheaper for a utility to give a feeder with good reliability, great reliability, instead of addressing an underperforming feeder, that's often what they're going to do. Because in almost every state, utilities are graded on these systems averages. So let's look at what we learned about what more frequent outages look like. We asked utilities, what was the duration of the typical power outage that you experienced in the last 12 months? So what power outage did they see most frequently? As you can see, the 5 to 59-minute category has stayed pretty stable over 4 years, while the longer duration versus momentary duration outages have kind of traded back and forth a bit. So challenges to energy reliability and resilience are hard to predict year over year. 1 year, you may be dealing with lots of major events that take the grid down for days, and another year, you may need to focus more on transient events that knock the grid off for a few minutes. One way to look at this is that we'd like to minimize the hour-plus outages at the top. That shifting of the most common outage down to the shortest time frame is probably what we would like. We want outages to be shorter. But we also have to consider the fact that if we reduce longer-term outages and we trade it for lots of other short-term outages, that may not be great. So the way you would attack these problems has got to be taken into account, because as we're going to see here, short-term outages aren't necessarily always better. So let's explore the different kinds of outages and how they're impacting C&I companies. It turns out that any outage, no matter how short, is costly for businesses, and there are some fixed costs even for a momentary blink. The professionals we reached out to had a lot of clarity around how energy outages are impacting their operations. As you might guess, the aspects of these businesses most likely to be affected by outages were IT systems, production, and communications. The distribution of these challenges didn't really change between short and long outages, which honestly, I expected they were going to be a little bit more different than they are. What we really heard about in written comments was that critical IT and manufacturing equipment typically required a lengthy reboot. So while a long outage may mean more downtime, there's a baseline impact of any outage regardless of length. When we asked respondents whether cumulatively short outages or long outages had a greater impact on their operations, the answer was pretty evenly divided, 49% saying that short duration outages had the greater impact. So what does this cost? Let's talk about money. 22% of respondents said that a typical outage will cost $100,000 or more. Of those folks, 80% of them lost power monthly or more frequently. So even if the loss was a minimum of $100,000 and the minimum frequency of once a month, these businesses would still be each losing $1.2 million a year because of our energy outages. That's not everybody we surveyed, but it's a decent chunk of them, and it's a lot of money, particularly when you consider the fact that, remember, the average revenue was $75 million. $1.2 million out of $75 million annual revenue, that is a considerable amount of money and noticeable in the bottom line. When we dug into how much short duration outages specifically cost, we found that 34% of companies lost $50,000 or more in a typical short duration outage. Mind you, this can happen because a branch that hasn't been cut back falls because it's blown by a strong wind. It can happen because a squirrel makes a bad life decision. It can happen because of a problem on a completely different line that causes a disconnect at the substation before it's cleared and reclosed. But these reasonable and seemingly unavoidable blinks on the power system are having a major impact on U.S. businesses. For those respondents seeing weekly power blinks, many of them could be losing $600,000 or more per year from short outages. This starts to rise to the level of importance that companies start to want to do something about it. So as a result, we're seeing C&I companies taking steps to measure outages and the impact on their businesses. 58% of respondents said they now have systems in place to measure outages. And of those folks, 77% said they are now tracking the impacts of outages on their operations and equipment. These numbers are up over previous years, so it's clearly becoming more visible on the utility customer side. To understand more about what can be done on this on both sides of the meter, we're going to hear from Kyle Julian of S&C. Kyle works with C&I customers from all over, helping them address reliability challenges. He's going to speak on what these issues look like in the real world and how C&I customers are addressing them. He's going to start us with another quick question. Go ahead, Kyle.
Great. Thank you, Brian. And this is our third and final poll today, and it's an easy one. If your internet went out tomorrow, would you want it to go out for a full hour once or intermittently, but 60 times? So just imagine it's supposed to be a relaxing Friday night at home and you fire up Netflix. I'll just pick your poison on what type of outage might occur. Give you guys a few more minutes. And also a reminder, be sure to post your Q&A questions below for later, and we'll address those as soon as this section is over. All right, great. Looks like I agree with you there. For a full hour once was the overwhelming response. So hopefully that question didn't hit too close to home. All right, now let's get into this next section titled, as my dad would always say to me, opportunities for improvement. And so far, we've seen that the realization, tracking, and monetization by C&I companies of the actual financial impact of any outage type has led us to the current state of intolerance of anything but 100% perfect power reliability versus accepting some outages as inevitable as it was in the past. Now, valid or not, the electric power industry already has some black eyes due to wildfires, environmental emissions, and of course, pretty much any severe weather event. And something to consider is that those large and technology companies impacted by this usually have disruptive cultures and no problem projecting their voices to influence policymakers. So let's use the rest of this report to help frame what C&I companies actually want from their utility, what they are willing to do about it, and how both parties can work together to find outcomes that are a win for everybody. All right, and let's think about your poll responses in the context of power reliability preferences from the report. And as Brian mentioned earlier, the question in our report was basically the same of referring to power outages. Would you rather have more frequent but shorter outages or less frequent outages but for a longer duration? We then matched those responses with their responses to an earlier question about the actual duration of outages they've experienced over the last year. So of companies whose typical outages lasted less than 5 minutes, the majority noted a preference for better reliability. And those who had typical outages that lasted between 5 minutes and an hour, a slim majority indicated their preference for better resilience. So what does that tell us? Well, an important takeaway here is that this shows that C&I companies value reliability just as much as they do resilience. But what do you do with this information? Well, the resilience or duration of outages here is usually the low-hanging fruit, and it's tempting to start here, but this is more of typically a one customer Band-Aid solution, like adding backup generation, auto transfer switches, battery systems, or even a microgrid. And these localized solutions can be very effective, but I think there's a little grass is always greener going on here. So let's take a look at data centers. They have fabulous resilience, incorporating most all of the solutions I just mentioned into each site and a whole lot more. So resilience is great. Are they not worried about utility reliability then? No, they're terrified of even a utility momentary outage, especially when they happen frequently. Whether you look at the Uptime Institute or any other data center industry study, or just ask anyone, they always find the largest root cause of failure is the one cause that industry does the most to prevent, which is the loss of power to the site, which usually hovers around 40% of all failures. So even with the most resilient and redundant user systems in existence, that little blip from the utility system is still that boogeyman they all dread. So the point here is that I don't see this as a unique problem in data centers. Now look around at any business or factory or even your own home. IT downtime doesn't just mean you lose that email that you were about to send. We're seeing exponentially more robotic assembly, automated machinery, inventory, production lines, pharmaceuticals and cold storage come to mind. Really more cases than I could possibly list. Everything is connected, controlled, and synchronized. And when that all stops, even just for, in some cases, a split second, it takes much longer to get that back up. And usually with a lot fewer people than were on hand in the pre-Internet of Things days. But the utility backbone of these advanced systems are comparatively ancient technologies. So my view is that every company is already or soon will be a technology company of some measure, meaning their tolerance for outages of any frequency or duration will be like dealing with a data center as every customer. And they aren't being totally unreasonable. Outages, especially momentaries, are just more harmful and costly than they were ever before. So with that in mind, a better approach might be to think bigger and first address the problem areas with recurring outages of any length and taking a more systemic approach. As you all well know, every distribution is unique and complex, so there's no magic bullet for managing sustained and transient faults, as much as we'd all like there to be. But if you strategically integrate the right number of innovative technologies close to where faults occur most, you can improve your reliability, customer satisfaction, and reduce your operating costs, which then frees up resources for proactive maintenance and for addressing those one-off frequency and duration problems that remain. The examples of the results of deploying an ambitious grid hardening strategy were discussed in our last webinar, where you can see how Florida Power and Light invested in leading edge technologies designed to tackle outages at specific trouble points in their distribution system, feeders, laterals, and overhead transformers. And that effort yielded massive improvements to customers throughout their system. And this type of approach is certainly not new to most of you, but another thing that FP&L did well was to clearly communicate their plans and share their meaningful before and after metrics to their customer base. So now that we've established what C&I customers want, which is something close to perfect power, we tried to bring them back to earth by asking what they were willing to do about it. So here's some good news. We asked what they'd be willing to pay in order to reduce outages by 20% in steps of a 5 to a 20% premium. And especially for the highest paying customers like healthcare and manufacturing, the responses showed a reasonable willingness to pay for improved service. And here's an opportunity for improvement for anyone. To me, this also reveals they'd likely invest an equivalent amount to make improvements behind the meter if that would give them an equal or better result than if the utility made upgrades on their own system at a cost to the customer. And if the utility is already in dialogue with the customers, you might leverage your non-regulated service organization's work on the customer site to complement potentially less costly improvements to your actual system versus an unjustifiable expense of, say, undergrounding a long section of line to satisfy a single C&I user. So being part of this joint solution is a great outcome. So this might seem far-fetched, so here's a recent example of what I'm talking about. A large hospital campus and neighboring businesses needed an alternate service due to extended and frequent outages with their single utility feed. Now, adding an alternate feed from a second substation wasn't financially justifiable for the utility due to the distance and right-of-way challenges. Instead, the hospital and the utility worked together to come up with a really creative solution. The hospital campus leased the land for a large-scale battery storage microgrid project to the utility. And they agreed that the hospital campus would be billed only at the same rate they paid at their other sites on the utility system with 2 traditional feeds. The utility also sized the energy storage system large enough to serve as an alternate feed to neighboring businesses who agreed to pay a premium rate to the utility for this. So we've talked about what C&I companies want, what they're willing to do about it. Now let's finish up with more on how to get to a mutually beneficial outcome. So despite some of the responses that paint a rather bleak situation, it was clear that C&I companies desire to work with their utilities to address these concerns. Now here's an important finding. A third of our respondents said they weren't given the opportunity to talk to the utility directly about their concerns. That's a huge bucket of key accounts that feel ignored. But making a turnaround isn't insurmountable at all. From what I've experienced, the utility customer relationships that have improved the most seem to have a few things in common. First is they have proactive conversations, really an ongoing dialogue about what's going on, bad or good, including the chance for you to talk about longer-term system improvement efforts that they would otherwise have no clue about. Maybe one of those respondents complaining about momentaries doesn't realize you'd made system improvements to reduce the duration of outages. And the next phase of improvements will address the momentaries they're now seeing. But left out of the conversation, they might assume their service has gotten worse, and the momentaries are just the rumblings before the big one hits. The second thing is that I've seen is that they've established measurements to reflect on that are useful to both the customer and the utility, not just what the regulators require. And the third thing sounds simple enough, but it's important that they feel like they're part of a strategy for improvement. Whether that includes upgrades on your side of the meter or theirs or both, you can be a partner. Now I'll leave you with a final story to illustrate how this cooperative mentality led to win-win solutions for the utility and the customer. So years ago, I traveled a few days with a utility account manager who always seemed to be on the defense. And several of his data center accounts had complained about various reliability problems for years without anything being really acknowledged by the utility. So I came up with a few solutions that, for each of those cases, and off we went. And the customers loved the idea that the account manager was smiling ear to ear, and 100% of those meetings ended with the customer baffled when the account manager said the customer would have to pay the utility for these improvements. Well, there was no trust. That didn't work. So fast forward to many years later, I was working with an account manager from a different utility. They had attracted a large data center into the area, and since this utility didn't allow customer-owned or built substations, they agreed the utility would build and own a dedicated substation to support the single, very power-hungry site. Well, of course, they quickly ran into a problem when the data center signed the client of a lifetime, but would need the substation built much faster than the utility was able at the time. The data center began looking at a site in another state where they could build in time to support their large client. Now, the account manager was doing a great job and was in active dialogue with the data center and was really searching for solutions. We spoke, he reached out to understand more about data centers' needs and how utilities elsewhere might manage this, and we presented an idea to the data center. And with the cooperation of the data center company's CEO advocating for this to the regulators, the utilities account team successfully petitioned to have a new rule put in place that allows for customer build and own substations in certain circumstances. And next, to solve the timeline problem, the customer worked with a substation engineering firm who knew the utility and the data center, had it built privately, on time and on budget. And finally, since the data center didn't want to own the substation in the first place, the deal was structured so that ownership was transferred to the utility upon commissioning. And this wasn't a one-off solution. This new approach has since attracted several other large data centers to the area. So that's enough story time, and I hope we really hit home that although the customer perception of utilities might not seem great, they consider you an incredibly valuable resource and desire to work with you. You may very well be the most important link in the supply chain. These businesses were built on innovating to overcome obstacles, so here's a chance for our industry to collaborate with the best innovators in the world to come up with creative and mutually beneficial solutions. So thanks so much for your attention, and let's turn it back over to Spencer for our Q&A session.
Thanks, Kyle. And thanks again to Kyle, Brian, and Chad for sharing these insights today. We covered not only where manufacturers see themselves and where the industry sees itself going from a commercial industrial standpoint, as it's where it's going after the COVID-19 pandemic. We go over the 2021 perceptions that these customers have on their power reliability, and then we've covered some solutions today on how the utility and the commercial industrial customers can work together to mutually beneficial outcomes. But we have a lot of questions that have come in, and so I want to jump right into it. Just before we get started, as you process this information, if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom. We already have a couple, but please feel free to continue to do that. We'll keep this going up until 12:30 to answer some of your questions. But right off the bat, I've got one here that says, who do you believe is more responsible for protecting themselves against outages, the customer or the utility? I had a discussion with the utility last week, and the feeling was split between 4 different engineers.
Well, you want to take that one?
Sure. Well, I think an important thing that was said in that question was we had a discussion, and I think that really depends on the case, what their needs are, if they're in line with what the customer, and if the customer's needs are in line with what the utility can provide. And if you set expectations and develop a plan to get there, then it doesn't have to be pointing fingers. It can be a joint solution.
Brian, anything else to add?
I mean, I would say that, when regulators, and the reason why utilities are in most cases regulated are because they are given monopoly power. They are given the sole franchise to provide electricity, and there are some minimums that they're expected to achieve on that front. I think, as Kyle said, as energy needs change, there's a reasonableness question here. Utilities can't be expected to, do backflips overnight. They can only getting new elements of a distribution system built out takes time. So I think on a day-to-day basis, it's definitely on the utility to provide reliable electricity. As needs change, a partnership has to take place.
Got it. We got a couple questions that I'm going to summarize into, I think, a general, there's interchanging of the term power quality and reliability. So, I guess the general question that I'm seeing from a couple different people is that when we talk about reliability, are we talking about power quality? Are those synonyms or are those different things?
Sure. You can, for these purposes, you can use them as synonyms. Some loads are more sensitive than others. So like a data center, they would definitely, something that would affect them that really wouldn't affect, say, a restaurant. There are different things, but you can use them interchangeably.
I think that goes into kind of another grouping of questions that we have, which is, so what are some of the practical solutions to actually solving some of these power reliability issues? Is it UPS equipment? Is it voltage regulators? Is it microgrids behind the meter? What is it, equipment, or is it other types of things? What are some of the solutions that are available out there?
Guess that one's for me again.
Yeah, probably. I'll follow you up, but go ahead.
Sure. Yes is the answer to that. I mean, obviously it depends. As I hopefully got across that yeah, there's definitely some, you can look at every case and say, yeah, we're going to drill down and we're going to fix it for this customer only. But you're going to spend a lot more time and money just if that's your only approach. So there's a lot of other avenues you can go down to improve that. And it's not just like I said, there's not one thing that is the magic bullet for that.
Yeah, I would reiterate what Kyle said before, which is that the first solution has always got to be communication. People need to realize that the problem is happening. And, there are examples I've heard where it's like, we're having this problem, we're at the end of a feeder and we go out all the time. Somebody went out and said, oh, I found this very specific problem that we can fix. And sure, great, that's good. But more often, if we're talking about an area, a set of utility customers having a range of challenges, is probably a range of solutions. There's equipment opportunities. There are Sometimes peak demand issues. If a utility line is kind of approaching its max potential load, there are some demand side management opportunities. And if in cases, S&C has worked with utilities where they said, look, there's physically no way for us to give these folks the power quality and the reliability they deserve. So we created other solutions like, energy storage microgrids and things like that allowed us to be more creative.
I think this next question's for Dr. Motre, and the question is related to there seems to be a positive outlook as far as manufacturing production. Is there any insights as to what manufacturers are looking to do to grow their facilities in the context that are they growing the energy demands at their existing sites? Are they building elsewhere? Things like that.
So that's a great question, Spencer. And I think one of the things that we continue to hear, certainly in the post-COVID era here, is everyone is looking at reevaluating their supply chain, right? And to be fair, I think they were already doing that. I think they were doing it because of the trade war and a whole host of events that have happened globally over the last 4 or 5 years. Now, it's not totally sure what that means, right? Companies, of course, that might mean that they are reevaluating the number of suppliers they have, or maybe they're making sure that there's duplication in terms of where they're buying stuff. But from a U.S. standpoint, what we are hoping is that means that there's going to be more production in the U.S., right? It's easier to monitor quality when it's in the U.S. Logistics costs are obviously getting higher. And so you are already seeing that trend here. And what we have continued to argue is that we have this window here where people are talking about reevaluating their supply chain, that we should increase overall activity within these shores. And so if that happens, and to the extent that it is happening, that obviously is going to boost overall energy usage, not just for S&C, but for, kind of across the country. And so I do think that that's a nice opportunity for us to make sure we have smart policies in place that are going to enable even more activity in the US, and obviously then by extension, more energy usage.
Excellent. Another great question. I'm going to try to paraphrase it a little bit here. Is a lot of the solutions you all talked about helps one customer, and it's tough for the utility to then go get that approved as part of their rate case. And so how do you get a solution, an investment made for one customer that doesn't benefit multiple customers on the grid approved as part of the rate case?
Well, it depends on the solution you're picking, but I think that you absolutely can approach solutions saying, hey, I want to affect the entire area with this. If one customer is having a particular challenge, the chances are, if it's only affecting that customer, the chances are it's probably a relatively small and relatively localized challenge. But it's more likely that if that customer is having problems, a lot of customers are having problems. And that solution then becomes a distribution grid solution. I agree that it is difficult to rate case a solution for just one customer. But at the same time, a lot more states are looking at alternative ways to evaluate reliability. I talked about SAIDI and SAIFI being system averages. Some states are now using customers experiencing multi-interruptions to see how many customers are experiencing more than 5 interruptions or 7 interruptions a year. They're looking at worst performing feeders. So which feeders are really having trouble? And regulators don't want utilities to have certain feeders that are just absolute dogs where, well, you don't want to be on that line because it just has poor service. So utilities are expected to kind of raise their entire territory up to a certain level of service. There are certain circumstances, but particularly where we talked about where needs change, where you say, oh, we're expanding operations, or we're putting in an electric vehicle fleet charging station, where the customer and the utility really do have to create a partnership and potentially sharing some of those challenges.
Okay, so another good question, and we got a couple questions kind of in this line here, but fundamentally, how do you convince the C&I customer to pay for the system needed to provide uninterruptible power?
Well, I think if we keep using this data center example, but it's a great evolution in the way that their needs change and their sizes changed. Back in the old days, they would just accept low voltage power for, like any other commercial business. They grew, and obviously needing better control of their power quality and power reliability, whatever term you want to use. A lot of them actually chose to, yes, give me the service at medium voltage, or give me the service at high voltage. I'll have my own substation. That gives them the ability to choose the equipment, the level of redundancy, the maintenance schedule, all under their umbrella. And really, for that level of service, what a C&I customer can do is likely going to be more than the utility could get it approved, like we said, for one customer.
Yeah, utilities are not going to be able to provide anybody with 5 or 6 nines of reliability. And if you need it, well, then you just made your own case, in terms of if you say, look, I need 6 nines of power reliability in order to run my business. Well, if you need it, then you're gonna have to pay for it.
Okay. Good question here. That I think it's worth talking about, but I think earlier you mentioned how long-term outages increase short-term outages. How do long-term outages increase short-term outages?
I wasn't suggesting that addressing long-term outages necessarily increases short-term outages, but if let's say we want to, clear a fault on a system, and we use reclosers all throughout that system to basically, okay, well, there's a fault, so we're going to basically we're going to create a break in the line, and then we're going to go and figure out where that problem is, solve it, and bring it back. Well, if you're trying to avoid some of the longer outages, you might actually bring down a larger section so you can very quickly figure out where the problem is and very quickly isolate so that as few people as possible are down for more than a couple minutes. Okay, that's great. But as you're doing that hunt for where is this outage, now more people experience a blink than would have otherwise. So that is one way that you could reduce the number of people experiencing a long outage, but increase the number of people experiencing a short outage. So it's possible to do that, and you could design something the other way too. So this is a technical issue that utilities have to deal with when they make a strategy of what are we okay with, how do we want to solve this problem, and what is tolerable. I mean,
Kyle, I think this. Kyle, do you want to add on?
More to fix both, but it's very expensive.
Yeah, well, and I think that goes back to having those conversations with the C&I customers, because many of them likely have no idea what's going on. They say, "Oh my gosh, this has gotten way worse." Whereas as an account manager, you could go in and say, "Here's what we did. We've virtually eliminated those long outages you were experiencing. Now you're going to, unless it's a dire situation, you're going to have outages of a very short length. Now that you know that, here's what you can do." And these would be some customer side of the meter improvements, like a UPS unit on critical loads that can just ride through those momentaries, versus if they had that many long-term outages before, then that solution wouldn't be economically viable for them. So it's all about that dialogue.
So I'm hearing consistently it starts with talking.
Yeah.
Dr. Matre, I think this next one's kind of up your alley. You had shown the chart regarding what manufacturers are concerned about. Can you give any insights as to how that's changed over time, the last couple of years versus the last decade or so?
Well, I think I'll start with the obvious, which is rising raw material costs, right? I've been at the NAM actually 10 years this month, and it's the first time rising raw material costs have been the number one issue. Now, we've certainly had moments where it has been strong, right? Think back to 2018, for instance, they were pretty strong, and everyone was worried about costs and logistics costs, et cetera. But I think that really just speaks to just how unique of an environment we are in right now with the supply chain disruptions that were mentioned in the poll that we took early on. The weather disruptions that obviously impacted power, right? Speaking relevant to this webinar. And so I think that certainly is one thing that's changed. The one constant throughout this whole process is that the issue of workforce talent has been one that has really kind of been at the top of the list throughout this entire time, right? That to me, that speaks to it's more of a structural issue, not a cyclical one, that as baby boomers retire, where is that next generation of worker going to come from? And manufacturers have really seen this coming for a while. It was much more exacerbated, I think, last year at the beginning of the year when we had 3.5% unemployment rate and the labor market was pretty tight. But it's still true today. Given the fact that you've had some baby boomers retire, you're having some unemployment insurance issues, which are kind of complicating people getting workers, et cetera. So that's kind of the one constant that's kind of throughout this process is workforce. But definitely those supply chain disruptions, logistics, rising costs, I think are certainly speaking to what's really first and foremost in a lot of people's minds right now.
Okay. And I think, as you mentioned, Chad, that the supply chain disruptions aren't just from their vendor, from the suppliers they have for their actual products, but also, that electricity is considered part of their supply chain.
Yes, definitely.
Awesome. Kyle, I think this one's directed at something you covered, but you had mentioned that commercial industrial customers are using systems to measure both the number of outages they have and the expenses to them. Can you just talk a little bit more about what those systems are?
Definitely. Again, rewind to the old days, meaning like 7 to 10 years ago, and selling switchgear, we'd always ask, hey, do you need any sort of metering or monitoring on this? And the standard answer was almost a joke, like, no, I know when the power is out, the lights are out or nothing works. And it's like, okay, fine. Now the opposite is true. It's everybody needs to know what's going on, not just to say, okay, the lights are out and now I have a blip on my screen. Great. It's where is this coming from? What caused it? What type of problem were we having? Was it a power quality issue? Did we just have a sag, or did we have an actual outage? So really stepping outside of their core business for most of these companies to look at that kind of data and analyze it and really get to know it really indicates to me how important and how closely they're tracking that.
All right. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One question that came in is, were there any insights to customers who experienced no interruptions? You talked a lot about everybody, a large majority of them experiencing interruptions. Were there any respondents who said, I have perfect power as it is today?
There were not.
Any insights to that? As far as, I think the question's going into, is it really that all commercial industrial customers experience interruptions annually?
Yeah. I mean, some of them were much less frequently. I mean, we highlighted some of the folks who have them weekly and monthly and things like that, and that was definitely a subset. There were some that experienced a few outages a year. No one that we spoke to said, no, we just didn't have a power outage last year. That didn't happen. I don't really know what that means, other than, hey, I talked about some of the very unavoidable things that can cause power outages. It's hard work running a distribution grid. And we should never expect utilities to be able to deliver perfect power, probably to anybody, because there are just so many threats to that infrastructure, both kind of natural and unnatural, that we have to expect this as part of life. The key is deciding how much effort do we want to put into ameliorating the challenges we have and kind of finding that Pareto optimal outcome.
Okay. All right, one more question to wrap us up. My utility is starting to see grid defection. Is this something that the team is seeing or that was covered in the responses in the report?
We didn't really ask about grid defection. Maybe something we ask about in future years. We didn't see much of it in the written responses, the long responses to some of our open-ended questions. I don't know about, Chad and Kyle, if you have seen a lot of that. In most places in the US, I don't think full grid defection is currently that cost effective. There are places, remote places where it makes sense, or where, the utility never really went with the distribution lines. But these days, if you wanted to defect from the grid, you're talking about building yourself a microgrid. And if you want to defect from the grid, you have to build that microgrid to your peak demand. The hottest day in August or the coldest day in February, have to be able to serve all of that. You have to buy and own and operate, maintain the equipment to hit that peak all year long. And in most cases, that is just not that cost effective.
Kyle, anything else to add quickly?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I hear a lot of discussion on that. But generally the size of power users that we're talking about, the cost to do that would be astronomical at this point. But the conversations are happening.
All right. Well, I want to be mindful of everybody's time, but before we wrap up, as a reminder, we'll be sending a recording of this webinar and the new CNI 2021 Commercial Industrial Reliability Report from S&C to all those who attended today. In addition, when you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted with a 1-question survey on today's webinar. We would greatly appreciate a few seconds of your time to complete that and provide us some feedback. With that, I want to thank Kyle, Brian, and Chad for their time today. To all of our attendees, we had over 100 people come to this. On behalf of S&C, thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us today. We really appreciate it and hope you found it valuable as well. Have a wonderful rest of your day and be well.